Some nurses play hero to compensate for what they lack in actual competence. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 47 minutes before the patient in ICU 3 coded and proved him catastrophically wrong. Natalie Hayes folds gauze in the supply room of St. Michael's Hospital in Savannah, fluorescent lights humming overhead like a swarm of insects trapped in plastic. Her hands move with mechanical precision, no tremor despite the grand rounds humiliation an hour ago where Whitfield had used her blood donation to an Army Ranger as a teaching moment on boundary violations and emotional decision-making that compromises professional judgment. The other nurses had looked away. He'd suggested she was playing hero to compensate for inadequacies, his motivations transparent to anyone who'd seen him cornered by her quiet correction of his medication order in front of a board member last month. She'd saved a patient's life with 4 words. Whitfield had never recovered from the implication that he needed saving from himself. The gauze folds into precise squares. Fold. Stack. Fold. Stack. Her jaw tightens once, imperceptibly, but her hands don't shake. They never shake. They haven't shaken in 17 years, not since the convoy burned outside Fallujah, not since she'd carried 2 soldiers and 1 Army Ranger through 4 kilometers of Tikrit's burning streets with rounds snapping past her helmet like angry wasps. Her composure is a weapon she'd honed on a battlefield where hesitation meant death, and she deploys it now in this sterile supply closet with the same precision she'd once used to apply tourniquets in the dark. The antiseptic smell burns her nostrils. She reaches for another stack of gauze pads, the boxes stacked 6 deep on the metal shelves. Her forearm brushes against the cool edge of the shelf, and the faint scar that runs along her skin, 3 inches long, pale against her olive complexion, catches the fluorescent light for just a moment before she pulls her sleeve down. A reminder. A clock. A countdown to a moment she'd been told would never come. The break room is empty when she deposits the restocked supplies at 1,447 hours. She opens her locker by habit, though she doesn't need anything. Her eyes find the pair of worn combat boots at the bottom, laces still knotted from the last time she'd tied them. The leather is creased and weathered, the soles worn at precise angles that only come from standing in formation for hours at a time. She touches one boot once with her fingertips, just a second, then closes the locker. The sound of metal hitting metal echoes in the empty room like a gunshot. By the vending machines at 1,502 hours, 2 residents mimic her calm demeanor while restocking their scrub pockets with granola bars. They lower their voices but not enough. She hears every word. Here's the catch in their laughter when they repeat Whitfield's phrase about emotional decision-making, here's the practiced disdain in their mimicry of her measured responses. She stands at the machine, hand hovering over the button for black coffee, and doesn't move. The vending machine whirs and drops the cup with a plastic clink. She retrieves it without acknowledging them, and that silence, that absolute refusal to flinch or respond or even register their existence, somehow makes them laugh harder. She can feel Whitfield watching from the nurse's station 20 meters away, his expression approving, and she realizes this is orchestrated. Planned. A public performance of her unworthiness. She doesn't flinch. Not when the older resident says something about boundary violations being code for attachment issues. Not when the younger one laughs and adds that some people compensate by saving lives to feel important. She brings the coffee cup to her lips, tastes the bitter heat, and walks past them like they're furniture. The coffee is terrible. She drinks it anyway. At 1,524 hours, Dr. Whitfield makes his call. She's organizing for tubing by caliber in the cardiac supply station when she hears his voice carry from the nurse's station, deliberately pitched loud enough that she'll catch every word. He's speaking to someone in hospital security, someone named Torres based on the response audible through the phone. His tone is clinical, measured, the kind of voice a predator uses when it wants witnesses to its hunting. "I need you to monitor one of our staff members," he says. Natalie Hayes, RN, ICU rotation. She's been demonstrating a concerning pattern of boundary violations with a patient in critical condition. The patient dependency on her is developing into something that compromises his clinical care. I need documentation of her interactions with the Ranger patient in ICU or 3. Any time she's at his bedside, any conversations, any physical contact beyond standard nursing protocols. This is a psychiatric concern that needs immediate attention. Torres's voice is inaudible, but Whitfield nods as if the security chief can see him through the phone. Exactly. Monitoring staff who can't maintain appropriate emotional distance is critical. Thank you. I'll follow up with the administrator. The four-tubing doesn't organize itself. Natalie's hands continue moving, caliber by caliber, her breathing steady and shallow. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead. A monitor somewhere in the distance beeps 3 times and goes silent. Her hands are steady as a surgical laser, and that steadiness is its own kind of violence, a refusal to give him what he wants, which is a sign that his words landed, that his attack penetrated her professional composure. He's good at this. She has to acknowledge that. He's not just cruel, he's strategic. He's planting evidence of her unfitness before anything has happened, creating a paper trail of concern, establishing witnesses to his concern, ensuring that when he moves against her, it will look like he's saving the patient instead of destroying a competitor. He's built his career on this kind of precision. But he doesn't know what she is. Not really. He sees a nurse who kept him honest in front of a board member. He sees a boundary violation waiting to happen. He sees emotional instability compensating for professional inadequacy. What he doesn't see is Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, who spent for years running black site operations across 3 continents for an organization that no longer officially exists, who carried wounded soldiers through active fire zones, who made decisions in 60 seconds that determined whether people lived or died. What he doesn't see is the woman who was buried deep enough that the CIA told her to stay buried, told her that surfacing would endanger asset networks stretching from Kabul to Morocco. What he doesn't see is someone who has already survived the worst thing a human being can survive and came out the other side intact. The four-tubing is organized by 1536 hours. Natalie deposits the last caliber and walks to ICU E3, where the Ranger patient lies sedated in the 3rd bed of the Ark, machines ticking and beeping their mechanical rhythm around his unconscious form. His blood pressure is stable. His oxygen saturation is acceptable. His heart rate hovers at 68 beats per minute, a healthy rhythm for a man whose body should still be in shock. She doesn't touch him. Doesn't lean close to his ear or check his bandages with more attention than the other nurses would. She stands at the foot of his bed like she's checking a chart, and her eyes find his right forearm where the foreline feeds into the cephalic vein. Just below the line, visible against his olive skin, she sees the letters. Her name. For letters in black ink, small but deliberate, the kind of tattoo a man gets when he's trying to remember something that trauma tried to erase. She has no memory of him getting it, no recollection of sitting for an artist or discussing designs. But she knows exactly when he got it. Knows exactly why. Tikrit. For years ago. The convoy burning. Rounds coming from 3 positions, probably RPGs staged in buildings to the east. The Ranger and 2 other soldiers trapped under a collapsed concrete barrier while the extraction bird circled 40 seconds out, close enough to see them but not close enough to land. Someone had to carry them. Someone had to cross for kilometers of active fire zone with wounded soldiers on her back and a weapon in her hands and make it to the extraction point before the helicopter ran out of fuel. She did that. She carried him through fire that felt like it was coming from everywhere at once, felt the weight of his armor and body and trauma all compressing against her shoulders. She carried him to the bird and stepped back for the medic to grab him, and he reached for her, and she shook her head once, and the door came up, and the rotors spun faster, and he was gone. He'd gotten her name tattooed as soon as he could find an artist, she realized. Some kind of anchor. Some kind of proof that it happened, that she was real, that the woman who'd saved his life was a fact and not a hallucination brought on by blood loss and morphine. Whitfield doesn't understand what he's looking at when he sees her standing at that bedside. He doesn't understand that the calm she maintains isn't emotional distance. It's professional presence. It's the composure of someone who has held dozens of lives in her hands and learned that hesitation is a luxury she cannot afford. She turns and walks out of ICU 3 at 1,543 hours. The next voice she hears is Whitfield's, and he's already on his second call, already activating his network, already preparing for the moment when the ranger in that bed will need something only she can provide, and Whitfield will be there to document her failure to maintain boundaries. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she knew exactly what was coming, and she couldn't do anything to stop it. The vending machine hummed its mechanical monotone as Natalie selected black coffee at 2:14 p.m., her movements economical and precise. She'd been avoiding the break room since grand rounds, since Dr. Whitfield had spent 45 minutes dissecting her donation decision in front of 30 residents and 3 board observers. The fluorescent light above the machine flickered once, twice, settling into its usual buzz. She was alone, or so she thought. 2 residents rounded the corner, their voices pitched loud enough to be heard, low enough to deny intention. The taller one straightened his posture, smoothed his expression into something flat and serene. "I'm Nurse Perfect," he announced to his companion. "I save everyone. It's called emotional maturity." The second resident swooned dramatically, pressing a hand to his forehead. "Oh, Nurse Perfect, what would we do without your excessive compassion?" Dr. Whitfield emerged from the stairwell exactly then. Natalie's eyes tracked the timing without looking directly at him. He stood 14 feet away, arms crossed, watching the performance with the satisfaction of a conductor hearing his orchestra play precisely as arranged. His smirk was the kind that came from knowing he'd orchestrated every note. Natalie's jaw clenched once, a single millimeter of tension that traveled from her molars to her temples and nowhere else. Her hands remained steady. She lifted the coffee cup. The plastic was warm against her palm, grounding. She turned and walked past both residents and Dr. Whitfield without acknowledgement, her footsteps neither hurried nor slow. Just a nurse going about her day. Just someone who didn't matter enough to defend. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part arrived at 2:56 p.m., carried on Dr. Whitfield's voice as she passed the administrator's office. "Security? Yes, I need you to monitor a staff member. Badge number N7743. She's displayed concerning boundary violations, emotional investment that clouds professional judgment. I'm concerned she may engage in further inappropriate actions. No, she hasn't violated protocol yet. Precautionary. That's all." He paused, listening. "Thank you. I appreciate your discretion." Natalie kept walking. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. The ability to compartmentalize was a survival skill she'd learned in Tikrit, where panic killed faster than bullets. Where the difference between living and dying often came down to whether your body betrayed you in the moment it mattered most. She'd trained herself to lock everything away, fear, rage, humiliation, and file it in a mental vault that wouldn't open until she was alone. She made it to the ICU supply room, where she restocked the crash cart with mechanical efficiency. For lines. Medication vials. Defibrillator pads. Each item placed with the same precise spacing she'd maintained for 8 years. The motion was meditative, purposeful. Her mind fractured into compartments, one part documenting what Dr. Whitfield was doing, another part calculating the institutional reach of his complaints, another part scanning the ICU for signs of the ranger's deterioration. She couldn't afford to be distracted. Not with him sedated in room 4, his forearm bearing evidence of a past that was supposed to stay buried. Grand rounds had been the first orchestrated humiliation. The second was happening in real time, watched by colleagues who'd heard Dr. Whitfield's security call and would report it to others. By nightfall, every staff member would know that Natalie Hayes was being monitored for emotional instability. By tomorrow, the story would have evolved into something more sinister, the unstable nurse who couldn't handle professional boundaries, who needed watching. The thing about institutional power was that it didn't require truth. It required the appearance of concern, the veneer of protecting the team, the careful documentation of behavior that seemed perfectly normal until someone suggested otherwise. Dr. Whitfield had been building this narrative since the moment she donated blood to the ranger. He'd seen the way her hands trembled slightly as she signed the consent form, not fear, but the muscle memory of someone whose body remembered things her mouth was legally forbidden to acknowledge. He'd noticed her knowledge when the ranger's initial labs came back, the way her eyes tracked his vital signs like someone reading a language most nurses couldn't speak. He was testing her, probing for weakness. And she had to give him nothing. At 3:22 p.m., as she was labeling sterile containers in the supply room's cool silence, she heard his voice in the corridor. "Nurse Hayes. May I speak with you?" She turned, her expression already neutral. Dr. Whitfield blocked the doorway, his posture radiating a kind of casual dominance that came from never having been refused. "I've been reviewing your personnel file," he said, stepping closer. 5 years of nursing. Nothing before that. Nothing substantial, anyway. He tilted his head as if genuinely curious. "Where were you for those missing years?" Before the credentials appeared in Savannah. Natalie met his eyes. She didn't blink. She didn't look away. She simply waited, the way someone waits for a predator to tire itself out on an unresponsive target. "What were you, Hayes? Failed out of medical school? Couldn't hack real responsibility?" He smiled, showing teeth. "You know what you are? You're a wannabe. A fraud who thinks one donation makes her a hero. One good deed erases all the inadequacy." He stepped closer. "You're a liability. And I'm going to prove it." She said nothing. The silence between them was so thick you could operate in it, could set instruments down on it like a surgical field. Somewhere in the hospital, machines beat their steady rhythms. Somewhere, patients suffered and healed and died. Somewhere, a man with her name tattooed on his arm was sleeping off morphine and trauma, neither of them yet aware that everything was about to change. Natalie set down the container she was holding. Her movements were deliberate, controlled, the movements of someone who'd learned that every gesture could be weaponized or used against her. She stepped around him, not pushing past, just moving through the space he occupied as if he were furniture. "You might want to step back, Dr. Whitfield," she said quietly. "You're blocking the supply room." He didn't move immediately. His face darkened with the particular rage of someone unaccustomed to being ignored. Then he stood aside, watching her leave with eyes that had already begun making phone calls, sending emails, building the architecture of her professional destruction. By 11:48 p.m., Dr. Whitfield would be making 3 calls. By midnight, he would have initiated a request to the Georgia Nursing Board for her complete personnel file. By 2:41 a.m., the outside investigator from Atlanta would have been contracted. But for now, in the moment she passed him in that doorway, none of that had happened yet. There was only this, her steady footsteps down the corridor, his angry breathing behind her, and the clock ticking down to something neither of them yet understood. The fluorescent lights hummed their indifferent witness. In the ICU, the ranger's monitor beeped its regular rhythm. And Natalie Hayes, who had once saved his life in ways that would take a Pentagon file to explain, walked forward into the night that would finally break open everything she'd buried. At 0247 hours, the cardiac monitor in ICU 3 erupted into a scream that made every nurse within 50 yards snap upright. Blood pressure 70/40. Then 60. Then crashing past 50 like a stone down a well. The ranger's chest rose and fell with the ventilator's mechanical rhythm, but his body was betraying him in ways the monitors couldn't explain, not yet. Natalie was in the medication room 3 corridors away, counting phenobarbital tablets with the precision that came from a decade of field medicine where every pill had to be accounted for, when the overhead code echoed through St. Michael's. ICU 3. Her hands didn't pause. 1, 2, 3. The count continued because discipline was the only thing that made people like her functional in civilian life. But her legs were already moving before her conscious mind caught up, muscle memory recognizing that particular urgency in the monitor's rhythm, the sound of a patient dying in real time. The ICU was controlled chaos when she arrived. Dr. Chen stood at the bedside with a stethoscope around his neck, listening to lungs that wouldn't tell him what he needed to know. The resident was already calling for a chest X-ray. The cardiac nurse was pushing vasopressors into the line. But nobody moved like they understood what was actually happening. Blood pressure 30/20 now. The kind of pressure that meant minutes. Maybe less. Natalie moved to the monitor, reading the waveform the way other people read faces. The QRS complexes were narrow, sinus rhythm collapsing under the weight of something mechanical. Not cardiac dysfunction. Not sepsis. Something physical. Something occupying space where it shouldn't. Pericardiocentesis, she said. Not a question. A statement. Like someone reading directions on a map. Dr. Chen turned to her with the kind of look that said a floor nurse didn't get to diagnose cardiogenic shock in the ICU. We need imaging first. We need blood pressure 20 over palpable. The ranger's oxygen saturation was dropping like someone had opened a drain valve inside his chest. Natalie was already moving to the bedding, already pulling back the blanket with the certainty of someone who'd done this in the back of a Humvee under fire with nothing but a combat medic's pack and the absolute knowledge that hesitation meant death. Needle decompression. Second intercostal space. Mid-clavicular line, she said, her voice dropping into a register nobody had heard from her before, not the deferential floor nurse, not the careful hospital employee, but something older. Something that had worn captain's bars before she wore scrubs. 18-gauge catheter. Now. The room held its breath. Dr. Chen reached for the procedure tray himself because arguing was a luxury they didn't have, and Natalie's hands were already prepping the site with the kind of sterile technique that came from having done this on 3 continents. The needle went in smooth and deliberate. The hiss of air escaping from the pericardial sac was the sound of pressure releasing, the sound of a body finally allowed to function again. Oxygen sac climbed. 72. 80. 88. Blood pressure rising like a patient pulling themselves back from the edge of a cliff. Sinus rhythm steady now, the monitor's beat becoming the rhythm of a body that wanted to survive. The ranger's chest expanded fully for the first time in minutes, his unconscious body catching the breath he didn't know he'd been unable to take. Nobody moved. The resident stared at the monitor like it had just rewritten physics. The cardiac nurse looked at the needle in the pericardial sac like it had appeared through divine intervention. Dr. Chen was watching Natalie with an expression that suggested he was rapidly performing complex calculations about everything he thought he knew about her. Natalie was already bagging the needle, already documenting the procedure with the clinical precision of someone who'd filed reports in places where paperwork could determine whether you got extracted or got left behind. 30 seconds of her hands moving, and a man had gone from exsanguinating in his own pericardial sac to stable vitals and a future. It shouldn't have been possible. It certainly shouldn't have been possible for the floor nurse who was supposed to know her place. The emergency resolved itself into the controlled vigilance of post-crisis care. The ranger was stabilizing. His oxygen was staying up. His pressure was holding. Everything a successful intervention should look like. Natalie stepped back from the bedside with the same mechanical precision she'd brought to it, her expression unchanged, her breathing steady, her hands already reaching for the documentation she needed to complete. Dr. Chen was still staring when she turned to leave the ICU. She could feel his eyes on her back, not hostile, not yet, but the beginning of calculation. The beginning of questions. The beginning of a man realizing that something didn't fit. The next voice she heard wasn't his. Dr. Whitfield is in the administrator's office, the charge nurse said, appearing like a messenger in a tragedy that was only beginning. With 2 board members. He's asking for you to come up. Natalie didn't answer. She just nodded once and started walking, knowing already what was about to happen. Knowing that the single moment of competence she'd allowed to show, the moment she'd chosen to save a life instead of maintaining her cover, had cracked something that couldn't be sealed again. The administrator's office on the 4th floor smelled like expensive furniture and the particular anxiety of people who'd been trained to avoid conflict. Dr. Whitfield was sitting in one of the leather chairs like he'd invited himself, which he had, his expression the satisfied look of someone watching his trap spring exactly on schedule. The 2 board members flanked him like ornaments, a woman in pearls and a man whose watch probably cost more than Natalie made in a month. "Ah," Dr. Whitfield said, his voice carrying the texture of mild concern stretched over absolute certainty. "Ms. Hayes. Thank you for coming so quickly. We have some concerns about your personnel file that we need to discuss." The administrator gestured toward an empty chair. Natalie didn't sit. Standing gave her sight lines to both doors and let her weight stay distributed in a way that made her harder to intimidate. It was a tactical choice she made without thinking, the kind of choice that had kept her alive through 12 years of work that didn't have names in official records. Your background before nursing school, the woman with pearls said, consulting a document that had Dr. Whitfield's fingerprints all over it. There's a gap. 7 years unaccounted for. The application materials list medical training, but the employers prior to 2018 can't be verified. And your performance metrics show clinical competencies that seem advanced for your stated experience level. The incident this morning, Dr. Whitfield added, his voice smooth as a knife, where you apparently diagnosed and treated a cardiac emergency that our attending physicians hadn't yet identified, that's exactly the kind of boundary violation that concerns us. Advanced knowledge without proper documentation. Impulse control issues masked as heroism. Natalie looked at him. Just looked. The way you looked at something that was moving toward you but wasn't fast enough to matter. When she spoke, her voice had dropped into a register that made the administrator lean back slightly in his chair. The patient needed intervention. The patient needed supervision through proper medical channels, the male board member said, his tone suggesting he'd been prepared for exactly this argument. We take employee credentialing very seriously. If there are discrepancies in your background, we've already submitted a formal request to the Georgia Nursing Board, Dr. Whitfield interrupted, speaking like someone delivering good news. Full file review. Employment history verification. We've also engaged an independent investigator from Atlanta to examine the gaps. Very thorough. Very comprehensive. If you have anything you'd like to disclose before the formal review begins, that would be advisable. The implied threat hung in the air like humidity. The investigator. The board. The questions that would keep coming until she either broke her silence or disappeared. Both options would trigger protocols that hadn't been activated in 4 years, the moment her buried identity surfaced. Natalie's jaw tightened once. Just once. But her voice remained level, almost distant. Is there anything else? Not at this time, the administrator said, clearly wishing he could be anywhere else. But we'll need you to remain available for questioning as the review proceeds. And your access to restricted medications will be temporarily suspended pending verification of your credentials. Understood, Natalie said. And then she turned and walked out of the office without waiting for dismissal, moving through the hospital corridors with the same steady pace she'd maintained through every humiliation, every calculated slight, every moment of carefully measured submission. The composure held. The mask stayed in place. But somewhere in the basement of her mind, alarms were beginning to sound. By 0800, the machine had started. The calls went out from Dr. Whitfield's office with the precision of someone who'd planned every contact, every favor, every relationship that could be weaponized. 3 board members received calls expressing serious concerns about credential verification. The Georgia Nursing Board received a formal written request for Natalie's complete employment history, complete with references to suspicious gaps and advanced competencies inconsistent with stated training. The outside investigator, a woman in a gray suit who looked like she'd spent her career finding things people wanted hidden, arrived by mid-morning with a notebook and the kind of polite questions that were actually interrogation tools wearing friendly faces. In ICU E3, the ranger stirred in his sedation, his fingers moving across the tattoo on his forearm like it was a map. 2 words in careful lettering. His name. And hers. Inked for years ago in a safe house in Oman by someone who understood that some debts couldn't be filed as official paperwork. His semi-conscious mind was reaching for something his trauma-altered brain couldn't quite grasp, a voice, a presence, hands that had held his life together in ways he could never quite remember but would never quite forget. The investigator was in the medication room by 0945, speaking with the same nurse who'd watched Natalie work for 5 years without ever asking questions. The advanced skills, she was saying, the way she handles crisis situations, has that always been consistent with her stated background. The nurse was loyal. But loyalty to Natalie couldn't compete with the weight of official authority. She's always been capable. more capable than most floor nurses. But nobody really questions it. You just kind of accept that some people are good at what they do. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. And Natalie was about to find out exactly how much watching she could bear before everything she'd buried came screaming back to the surface. By 11:30 hours, Dr. Whitfield sat in the hospital administrator's office with 2 board members, the kind of men who understood leverage and timing. He'd made the calls at dawn, first to his colleague at the Georgia Nursing Board, then to an investigator in Atlanta, each conversation brief and clinical. The narrative was simple: suspicious employment gap, medical knowledge that exceeded standard nursing credentials, a pattern of boundary violations. He presented it like evidence. The board members nodded, took notes. One of them asked about the blood donation. "Exactly," Dr. Whitfield said, his voice smooth as oil on water. "Playing hero. Compensating for something. Classic savior complex masquerading as compassion." He didn't mention that she'd corrected his medication order in front of a board member. That wasn't relevant. What mattered was building the case methodically, layer by layer, each call reinforcing the narrative until it became institutional momentum nobody could stop. The administrator called Natalie to his office at 11:45. She knew before she walked in, the security guard had already logged her name in the escort rotation. The office smelled of leather chairs and old wood. 2 board members stood near the windows, careful not to make eye contact. Dr. Whitfield sat with his hands folded, his expression arranged into something resembling regret. "Natalie," the administrator began, his eyes genuinely apologetic, which somehow made it worse. "We need to discuss your employment status pending some questions that have come to light." She said nothing. Waited. "Your employment history has some significant gaps," he continued. "The credential investigation we initiated this morning has raised concerns about your background verification. Until we can get clarity, the board has made a decision. It's not coming from me, you understand, but we're deactivating your badge effective immediately." "I see." Her voice was steady, flat as concrete. "Hospital policy," Dr. Whitfield added, leaning forward slightly, his tone carrying the weight of authority. "We can't have staff with questionable backgrounds providing direct patient care. I'm sure you understand." She understood more than any of them did. She understood that Operation Sandstone had been buried so deep that not even the Pentagon kept physical files. That surfacing would endanger asset networks across 3 continents. That she'd been told explicitly, by a CIA deputy director with a scar across his throat, that if her true identity ever emerged, it would be categorized as a national security breach. That the life she'd built in Savannah, the anonymity, the quiet competence, the name that appeared on no official roster, was always contingent on staying invisible. The administrator was offering her a way out. The investigation would confirm she didn't exist in any military database. No service record. No rank. No clearance. Just a woman with forged credentials who'd somehow fooled a hospital into thinking she was a nurse. Security escorted her to her locker at 1200. The boots were on the bottom shelf, worn leather creased from 1,000 patrols through Baghdad and Helmand, the soles embedded with dust from Tikrit that no amount of cleaning could remove. She reached for them, held them for 3 seconds, then placed them gently in her bag. The locker door closed with a click. She didn't look back. At 1600, she entered St. Michael's through the employee entrance, moving with the muscle memory of someone who'd navigated this hospital for 5 years without ever really belonging to it. The laundry room was empty, fluorescent lights casting everything in that flat institutional glow that made people look like they were already ghosts. The room smelled of detergent and steam, the dryers humming their mechanical rhythm in the background. She carried her folded scrubs, the blue cotton she'd worn through 2,000 patient interactions, 1,000 small moments of care that had meant nothing to the institution and everything to the people she'd touched, and set them on the counter. Her hands moved with the precision of someone who'd folded field uniforms in desert tents, dress whites in maritime barracks, and now nursing scrubs in a laundry room that belonged to no one's war but hers. Each crease exact. Each fold deliberate. The muscle memory of 30 years embedded in her fingers like shrapnel that never quite surfaced. She held the folded scrubs for a moment, the cotton still warm from the dryer, and then set them on the counter next to a stack of identical blue bundles that would be assigned to other people tomorrow. She walked out without signing anything, without saying goodbye to anyone, without a single look back through the corridor where she'd saved a man's life 6 hours ago and lost her own in the process. In ICU E3, the ranger's vitals were climbing steadily, consciousness pulling him up from the morphine fog like a man breaking the surface of deep water. His eyes were open now, actually focusing, and he was asking the day nurse questions she couldn't answer. "Where's the woman who was here?" Dark hair, built like she could carry a Humvee. The nurse checked her notes, found nothing. "I don't know, sir." "Let me check with the charge nurse." Dr. Whitfield reviewed the investigator's preliminary report at 17:30, sitting alone in his office with the door closed and the lights dimmed to a professional grey. No military service record. No discharge papers. No pension file. No records at all. Natalie Hayes simply didn't exist in any database that mattered. He forwarded the report to the board with a note marked urgent, recommend immediate termination hearing. Fabricated credentials represent a significant institutional liability. Suggest we move expeditiously before she has time to retain counsel or escalate this further. He sent it at 17:31. By 17:45, the board chair had replied with a calendar invite. The termination hearing was scheduled for 0900 the following morning in Conference Room B. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat in the darkness of her apartment in Riverside, hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold 2 hours ago, and stared at the shadow box her son had made 3 years ago without asking permission, 30 years of commendations arranged on black felt like trophies she'd tried to bury. The silver stars caught the streetlight coming through the window. The Navy Cross hung at the center, its eagle wings spread like something preparing to take flight. She thought about the explicit orders she'd received when Operation Sandstone was buried, surface, and asset networks fall. Children of operatives lose their protection. 7-year-old sons became liabilities instead of secrets. She'd taken the orders seriously in a way that most people never could because most people had never had to choose between their own survival and the survival of people they'd never meet but whose lives depended on her invisibility. At 08:07, she walked into Conference Room B in the same white blouse and black slacks she always wore, her composure wrapped around her like armor that had never required words to be effective. 6 board members sat along one side of the table. The hospital administrator occupied the center. Dr. Whitfield sat to his right, barely containing a smile. The hospital's legal counsel was there too, a woman who looked genuinely uncomfortable with the proceedings. And in the corner, standing with the posture of someone trained to observe, was an FBI agent in a dark suit who'd arrived that morning with a badge and a question nobody could answer: what had triggered the investigation? "We've called this hearing to discuss the termination of your employment," the board chair began, his voice formal and careful. "You understand the nature of these proceedings?" She nodded once. Dr. Whitfield began laying out his case methodically, each point reinforced by the preliminary investigation report. Fabricated credentials. Suspicious employment gap. Boundary violations including the blood donation incident. "She represents everything dangerous about unchecked staff," he said, leaning forward slightly. "Someone who doesn't understand the hierarchy of medical decision-making, who inserts herself into situations beyond her scope of practice, and now we discover she may not even be qualified to." The door crashed open. Her 17-year-old son Marcus pushed through, breathing hard, a shadow box clutched in his hand so tightly his knuckles had gone white. The room froze. Nobody moved to stop him. He had that quality of a young man who'd inherited something from his mother that made people instinctively stand aside. "Mom, they need to see these," he said quietly, setting the shadow box on the table. 30 years of commendations. Silver Star. Silver Star. Navy Cross. Bronze Star. Purple Heart. Purple Heart. Ribbons arranged in descending order of prestige, each one a moment somebody had decided she was worthy of recognition, but recognition was a luxury for people who could afford to exist in official records. The board members leaned forward in confusion. The hospital counsel's face went pale. The door opened again, and the ranger entered in a wheelchair, pushed by a man in navy dress whites. Not a young officer. Not a junior enlisted. For stars on the collar. Carrier group insignia. The brother. Nobody in the room knew his rank yet except the ranger, whose jaw had gone tight with emotion. 10 seconds of absolute silence. Sandstone 6, the ranger said, his voice cracking on those 2 words like they'd been carved from something deeper than memory. The security guard who'd been standing by the exit, a Fallujah veteran who'd worked private security for 12 years and never forgotten the faces of the operators he'd served with, snapped to rigid attention, his hand moving toward his chest in the beginning of a salute he'd suppressed for 5 years. "Master Chief Petty Officer, sir," he said, his voice steady and clear, and the whole room shifted in that moment like tectonic plates suddenly understanding their relationship to the ground beneath them. The security guard salute held for 3 full seconds before his arm dropped, and in that suspended moment, the fluorescent lights buzzed their indifferent witness to understanding. Marcus stood in the doorway still, the shadow box balanced on his palms like an offering, his 17-year-old hands trembling in a way his mother's never would. The administrator's pen had frozen mid-signature on the termination paperwork. The hospital's legal counsel was staring at the table, at his own reflection in the mahogany grain, as if the answer to his sudden helplessness might be hidden there in the wood. The ranger spoke again, quieter this time. "Sandstone 6 carried me 4 kilometers through Tikrit with 2 rounds in her leg and a 3rd through her shoulder." His voice cracked like old leather. "Carried Martinez too. And Chen. Solo. All 3 of us at once when the extraction bird could only take wounded." The wheelchair sat motionless, his older brother's hand steady on the push handle, navy dress white spotless as fresh snow, the gold shoulder boards of a rear admiral catching the harsh overhead light. "She stayed behind in the kill zone so we could load faster." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The room had become a vacuum. The security guard who'd been watching Natalie all week, who'd received the standing order to monitor her emotional distance, stepped forward in dress blues that were older than his watching assignment. "Master Chief Petty Officer, sir," he said, and his voice was the kind of voice that carried weight earned through decades. This was a man who'd stood in Fallujah. Who understood what it meant to be told to disappear. "St. Michael's Hospital is honored by your presence." Natalie hadn't moved. Her hands rested flat on the table in front of her, the same hands that had packed a wound in a burning street, that had folded hospital scrubs one final time in the laundry room 12 hours earlier. She watched the ranger's face, and something flickered there, recognition that she was still the same person who'd made the choice to stay behind. That her composure now wasn't indifference. It was steel. The speakerphone crackled. When the voice came through, it carried the weight of the Pentagon in every syllable. 2-star general, 14 years commanding JSOC task force operations across the Middle East. I'm reading from a classified after-action report dated April 15, 2009, Tikrit Sector. Operation Sandstone. The general's voice was steady, each word a nail in something. Master Chief Hayes, Naval Special Warfare Development Group, extracted 3 critical casualties under sustained small arms fire, approximately 2,847 meters through hostile territory, with wounds assessed at 90 minutes pre-treatment as critical and non-survivable without immediate intervention. The board members' faces were draining of color like someone had opened a valve. She remained in position to provide suppressive fire for the extraction helicopter. Sustained 2 additional hits to the load-bearing vest during the process. The 3 personnel she carried are alive today because of her decision to stay behind. That was not a nursing decision. That was a combat decision. The administrator's mouth had opened slightly. Closed. Opened again. "The record continues," the general said. Master Chief Hayes was classified as deceased per the official casualty report filed by the Pentagon. Operation Sandstone was terminated. 12 operatives were removed from active service rosters and integrated into civilian infrastructure under Federal Directive 7291 classified. Ms. Hayes was assigned to maintain cover identity and limit surveillance exposure to protect ongoing counterintelligence operations in 3 continents. A pause. Your hospital fired her for excessive emotional attachment to a patient. A patient whose life she already gave once, and was giving again. The ranger reached up and pulled his sleeve back. The tattoo was the size of a fist, inked in blues and blacks that had faded with 14 years of sun and time. A call sign. A date. A name written in letters he'd never consciously chosen to reveal, but that lived on his forearm like a reminder of what it meant to owe someone your life. Sandstone 6, he said again, because sometimes you say the thing that matters twice. That's what she called herself when everything was burning. That was her designation when she chose to stay behind so I could get home to my family. The FBI agent in the corner, the one everyone had assumed was there about the ranger, about threat assessment, stood and walked to the laptop on the table. His movements were practiced, the kind of movements people made when they'd been waiting for this moment. Waiting for the board to say the wrong things loudly enough to seal the case. He opened the screen. 3 days ago, Dr. Whitfield submitted a request through official hospital channels to access Nurse Hayes' complete personnel file. When that request was denied due to federal classification restrictions, he attempted a workaround. The screen showed emails. Meticulously crafted forgeries. Falsified Georgia Nursing Board letterhead. He created fabricated documentation claiming gaps in her employment history. Created false complaints from non-existent former employers. All for the purpose of manufacturing grounds for termination. The legal counsel's eyes had gone very still. Very focused. Falsifying federal records, the agent continued, is a federal crime. Attempting to access sealed Pentagon files is a federal crime. Conspiracy to terminate a federal asset and sabotage an active counterintelligence protection order is conspiracy to commit espionage. Dr. Whitfield stood. The chair scraped backward so violently it toppled. This is absurd. I was protecting this hospital from a security risk, from someone operating under a false identity. From a decorated Master Chief. The general's voice came through the speaker like a hammer. From someone who saved more lives in Tikrit than you'll touch in your entire career. The tone shift was immediate. Sharp. Command voice. The kind of voice that had moved battalions. You attempted to weaponize classified information for personal vindication because Nurse Hayes corrected a medication order in front of a board member. Because she made you look incompetent in a room full of people whose respect you needed. The administrator was already on his phone. Security to Conference Room B. The Dr. Whitfield is suspended effective immediately pending criminal investigation. The quiet that followed was the kind of quiet that only happens when someone's entire world compresses to a single point and detonates. Dr. Whitfield's face had gone the color of old plaster. His attorney stood, gathering papers with shaking hands, because knowing it was coming and watching it actually arrive were two different things. The board members were not looking at him. They were looking at Natalie. Really looking at her. Not as a nurse. Not as a subordinate. As something their entire hospital had been built on the back of and then tried to fire because a man with institutional power had felt diminished. The hallway outside the hospital lobby had been cordoned off by the time Dr. Whitfield was walked out in handcuffs at 1,100 hours. News crews had materialized like they'd been waiting, because someone had leaked and leaked comprehensively. The story had already made 3 local channels. The photographs captured everything, the handcuffs, the escort, the hospital badge being surrendered, the looks from staff members who now understood they'd been watching him destroy someone who'd been saving lives when he was still learning which end of a stethoscope to use. The resident who'd mimicked Natalie's calm demeanor by the vending machines turned away as he was led past. Couldn't meet the eyes of the colleagues who'd laughed with him. Shame, Natalie thought, watching from the 3rd-floor window, was a useful teacher if someone was willing to learn from it. The board meeting 3 days later was a formality, though a necessary one. The vote to terminate Dr. Whitfield's contract was unanimous. Revocation of privileges, immediate surrender of medical license pending criminal investigation, full cooperation with federal prosecution. His attorney presented mitigation arguments about character and judgment and a momentary lapse in professional boundaries. The board produced evidence that he'd manipulated credentials investigations against 2 other nurses before Natalie. that the network of allies he'd built, the calls to board members, the coordinated security monitoring, the strategic assignments of unfavorable rotations, was part of a pattern. The handcuffs in the lobby had been the visible symptom. The investigation revealed the disease. 2 years later, Natalie sat in her office at the VA hospital in Charleston, where she'd been offered the director position immediately after her security clearance was re-established. The worn combat boots sat on a shelf behind her desk, beside the shadow box Marcus had carried into that conference room. The Navy Cross was framed on the wall now, visible to anyone who walked in. The other medals she'd earned in designations they couldn't classify, she kept at home. Through her office window, she watched the courtyard where physical therapy sessions were running. A young nurse was correcting an attending's medication order in front of a patient's family member. Natalie made a note in her personal file, not a disciplinary file, a protection file. That nurse would be monitored, supported, protected. Because Natalie understood now what it meant to work in a system where speaking the truth about safety could destroy your career, and she would not allow it to happen to anyone under her command. The Ranger was in the building somewhere, working as a patient advocate now, fully recovered from the cardiac tamponade that had exposed everything. His tattoo was visible when he rolled up his sleeves during counseling sessions with other wounded. He'd become a symbol, though not intentionally. Just a man with his name inked on his forearm, telling other people's stories. Marcus brought her coffee that afternoon, pre-med now, 19 years old and working part-time in the hospital's volunteer program. He set it on her desk carefully, the way he'd carried that shadow box carefully. "The Ranger asked me to give you this," Marcus said, handing her a photograph. Crew of a naval carrier group, somewhere in the Pacific. A banner reading, "Thank you, Master Chief." Natalie touched the photograph once. Twice. Then placed it beside the combat boots, where it caught the afternoon light coming through the window. The staff meeting that afternoon was full. 37 people in the conference room, hospital administrators, resident physicians, nurses, physician assistants. Natalie stood at the front, the same way she'd once stood frozen in a hospital corridor while someone told her she was playing hero. The same way she'd stood composed while someone tried to erase her. "I want to talk about institutional courage," she said, her voice steady as a surgical laser. "About what happens when someone challenges authority. What gets taken from them? What gets risked?" She waited. Let the silence work. True heroism is what you do when the world stops watching. In a committee room nobody attended. In a correction spoken quietly because the right thing is the right thing even if it costs you everything. She looked directly at the young nurse who'd made the medication correction. "We protect people who do that here. That's not negotiable. That's not discretionary. That's the only reason this hospital exists." Outside, a helicopter passed overhead, medevac heading out, the rotor wash rattling the windows like distant thunder. Natalie heard it the same way she'd heard helicopters in Tikrit. The same way she'd hear them for the rest of her life. But this time, someone was coming home because the systems worked. Because she'd made sure they worked. Dr. Whitfield was teaching CPR fundamentals at Savannah Technical College for $16 an hour now. His medical license was suspended for 5 years. His pension had been dissolved in the settlement with his other victims. Yes, there had been others, and the investigation had found them all. The Georgia Medical Board had made him a cautionary tale in their ethics training modules. A name whispered in hospital corridors as a reminder of what happened when ambition became poison. Natalie didn't think about him often. She thought about the Ranger. About Marcus in pre-med. About the young nurse who'd spoken truth and lived to keep working. About the combat boots in her office, the evidence that you could disappear into civilian life and still be needed. Still be called back. Still matter. That's what it meant to be a Master Chief. Not the rank. The responsibility. The invisible line you drew and held even when nobody was watching, especially when nobody was watching. She'd crossed deserts to save lives. She'd saved lives in hospital corridors too. And the world had tried to fire her for it. The world was wrong. If you believe in stories about quiet strength and institutions that finally get it right, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who needs to know they matter. Comment below, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know your real story?